On Portable Magic today, I'm joined by Michael Pryor. Michael is one of Australia's most popular and acclaimed authors of fantasy and science fiction. He's published more than 35 novels with more than 60 short stories and has over 1 million words in print. I'm exhausted just thinking about it. He's one of the co-publishers of, I can't never say it properly, Aurolus. Is that the right way to say it, Michael?
Aurealis,
Australia's longest running fantasy and science fiction magazine. He's been shortlisted for their awards 9 times, and 9 of his books have been CBCA notable books. His latest book is Graveyard Shift in Ghost Town, and we're going to talk to Michael today. Fortunately, he's going to be able to help me with my pronunciation. Michael, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Sue. Thanks for this. This is a wonderful opportunity.
Oh, it's delightful. And it's lovely to talk to you because when I started writing way back when, I think in the 2000s, that's when I first met you. So it's been really lovely to have that. There's Michael again. It's seeing an old friend.
Oh, it's that sort of job. I intersect with so many people over the years at festivals and occasions, and it's always nice to see a familiar face among a crowd of strangers sometimes.
Oh, it's especially when you're at schools and all those little faces. It's nice to see an adult face that you know and can just go g'day to. So, Michael, what got you into writing in the first place?
Yeah, what got me into writing was reading. As a young person, the classic voracious reader. I just loved reading. I was always a little bit apprehensive if I didn't have a book nearby, if I didn't have a book on the go. And I think it's almost a natural transition for some people who are such intense readers to think, one day I'd like to do for other people what my favourite writers were doing for me. And so that's where it began. But as often the case, it's a germ of an idea that I'd get around to doing someday, and then life gets in the way and you have all sorts of business of growing up to do. And I went to university and I taught for 18 years. And the idea of writing was always at the back of my mind, but I was so busy, had so many things to do. I was raising a family. And I had one of those minor epiphanies where I was thinking, all right, this business of being a writer, do I actually want to do it, or am I just fooling myself? Will I keep putting it off forever and then die with regrets? So that was a day I actually sat down and started trying to write a story that day. It wasn't a very good story, but it was the beginning of becoming a writer. That thinking about writing is one thing, actually putting down and putting pen to paper, putting the hands on the keyboard is the next step. And gradually from there, I started by writing short stories. Gradually that turned into being, as I am now, a full-time writer.
And so do you think it was the teaching that drew you to writing for younger people, or do you think it was the fact of what it gave you as a young person reading that style of book?
Yeah, it was a sort of a calculated decision in that I felt I had a trial audience for me, that there were young people. I was teaching English. I was reading what they were calling young adult literature at that time, what was available. And so I was familiar, I thought, with the field. And so that was probably why I started writing in that area. Sort of running alongside that was the idea of writing for adults as well. But I didn't have the time to do both. I had to sort of commit to one. I tried keeping a lot of irons in the fire, but I was spreading myself too thin. And so it wound up that I devoted myself to writing for young people. My first novel that was ever accepted was for young readers or young adults. And so after that, I kept plugging away at that vein.
What was your first book?
First book was a book called The Mask of Caliban. It was a classic science fiction story. It was published in 1996. And when I wrote it on totally what we call on spec, that I had no one interested in it. I had no idea of where it was going to go. When I finally finished after about draft 7 or draft 8, I thought it was in a state that was complete. I had to ask myself, well, where's it going to go? At that stage, I was a member of the Fellowship of Australian Writers, and they used to send out a monthly bulletin newsletter. You remember them?
I do remember them.
They were pre-internet days, this was, of course. And so their bulletin was a useful compendium of competitions, of tips, of classes and sessions. And every so often they would have a little notice saying such and such a publisher is looking for so-and-so sort of books. And so the day I finished the draft 7 or draft 8, I got the newsletter in the mail, opened it, and the very first item was a hotter headliner looking for books for teenagers in science fiction and fantasy. Bam, and there it was. Of course, they did say that they were looking for books around about 50 or 60,000. Mine was 130,000.
Oh.
But I thought, what's a few words between creative people? And so I did, in all blindness or ignorance or arrogance, I sent it off to them and I got a reply. And the reply was, look, we really enjoy this, but it's too long. Could you cut it down? Could you cut it down to, say, 70,000? And I thought, well, that means cutting it in about half. Sure, I can do that. I mean, if you're that interested.
Once they're interested, it's like, sure, top, no worries.
Your heart just, it turns from being so far away from getting published to, I must be close. Mm. Of course, that's not always the case.
No.
But I went through in the painstaking business. It actually taught me a lot about concision and how to amalgamate characters, and even getting to the point of, those two words, I can put a hyphen between them. Instead of two, it's one. That sort of thing. Eventually, I got it down to about 76,000, and I just physically couldn't do any more. So I put a cover letter saying, yep, there's your 70,000 word book. And I sent it off to them and they accepted it. So a little bit later, they said, are you sure it was 70,000? Might it have been a little bit longer? I thought, I have no idea, really. It's these computer programs. So
strictly speaking, A isn't a word, it's a letter. You shouldn't have to count A,
Exactly. I think there's a lot of leeway. And so that was the first book. That was book number 1, and that was my introduction to the whole business in 1996. And I say the business because, it's a writer. You're a writer person. You're writing stories. You're doing that business. But then there are accountants. There are people who do numbers and figures and all of that. And that's an eye-opener when you get involved and you start to see that side of things. There's a big warehouse full of books somewhere that they have to put on trucks.
It's kind of, for me, publishing was a bit like when I got into radio. I got into radio thinking that music was what radio was about. And I found out that actually it's about the publishing. And I think I was about, pardon me, I was about 24. So I should have known better. But I just went, and it's the same with books.
Very much so, that whole side of the business. And so as writers, we tend to deal with the creative people, the editors and the designers and those sorts of people, but they're the tip of the iceberg of the whole other side of the business. There's so many people involved who earn a living. There are receptionists on the front desk, there are cleaners, there are people who organise the computers for the editor. Yeah, big business. And they're often multinationals too.
They are. Do you think you've got your head around all the jobs in publishing yet?
Reasonably, but I'm still startled. I'm still startled occasionally by the size of things, the number of people who are involved. What helped me is that after teaching for 18 years, I actually went into educational publishing. So I sat on the other side of the desk for a while. For 10 years, I was the person who was organising educational authors to make English textbooks, essentially. And that was my job. So I got an idea of, there are people who organise contracts. There are legal people involved in this business. Then all of the sales staff and the way they have to meet their various commitments and figures and KPI, all of that business. Yeah. So that's where I learned an awful lot about the commercial side of publishing, even though it wasn't what we call trade, it was education publishing for schools specifically. Yeah, the principles are the same.
Exactly. Going back to your first book and having to chop it in half, essentially, as a writer, would you prefer to chop it in half or to have to add words?
Chopping usually results in a better story, is my gut feel. Extending an idea can often stretch it. and probably stretch it beyond where it's needed to. Now, I've done both. In my time, 39 books, I have done both after a first draft or a second draft where it's just not meeting the word length. And I say requirements, but recommendations or that ballpark figure that I was aiming for and the publisher is happy with. Yet occasionally I've had to invent whole new episodes in a story just to bulk it out a little bit. Again, I'm experienced enough to do it very carefully and very judiciously. So I hope it's not feeling like I have just stretched and wallpapered over a crack or something like that.
Well, I've never thought that when I've read your work. So no, you've done it well.
Thank you. I'm glad. It's all, I mean, that is the ultimate test though, isn't it? What I think, I mean, writers are often the worst judge of their own work. It's the reader, the editor and the reader who need to be able to look at it and to form a judgment without my interference, really. And so that is the ultimate test, what the reader thinks.
I heard someone, and I can't remember who it was, say once that when you finished your book, it's kind of not yours anymore. It's out in the world. It's like a child. It's out in the world for its own journey. Do you find that with your books? Do you feel like you're letting them go?
Yeah, very much so. That they do disappear and they go off and they have to stand on their own 2 feet. There was and then there's a concomitant view. D.H. Lawrence said, "Trust the tale, not the teller." So he divorced the idea of the author from the work. Now people ask me, well, what about this character? What about that? My general response is, well, what do you think? How did you read it? And that's where it comes to. It's sort of a collaboration, the whole reading business, between the writer, the reader, and it's mediated by the book in the middle. But it's you do let these things go. I wrote The Laws of Magic, a 6-book series. And so I was working with some characters for 10 years, essentially. And you get to know them very well, and they're your friends. It was some of the hardest writing I've ever done, was writing the final chapter of the final book. It was really like those characters were going off. They were going to have a life. They were going to have adventures without me. We were breaking up. It was a poignant moment as a writer when that happened. And it also didn't teach me something, but it emphasized something that, yeah, as a writer, you live with them. You immerse yourself in the creative process with those characters, with the setting, and letting go can be hard sometimes.
Oh, very hard. I know, particularly with one of my books after, where the boy was quite a damaged boy, and it looked like his world had sort of righted itself, but I was sort of like, oh, I'm not ready to let you go yet, but the book had finished, so I had to let him go.
That's right. You do have to let them go in the end. You cannot be with them all the time. It would interfere with their ongoing journey. Yeah, we part ways.
Exactly.
Is what's happening.
So being a science fiction and fantasy writer, I'm assuming you have to be a planner.
By nature, I'm a planner. When I say by nature, it's also by necessity. When I began, I was very much a part-time writer. I had the day job and I'd come home, I'd get dinner for the family. I'd write every night for at least an hour a night. And because I had to ration my writing time so much, I felt like I couldn't sit there and go, where am I going now? I needed to have my plan and go, right, I'm up to point 4 in my plan, and that's what I'm doing right now. And that seemed to work for me, and it stopped me going round and round in circles and being an inefficient writer is what I had, a real fear of being an inefficient writer. And so, yeah, I do plan.
And by hand, or do you use a computer for your planning?
Everything is on the computer these days for me. In the beginning, a lot of it was on scraps of paper and with a pen and so on. But no, I plan on the computer. And the initial plan is very chaotic. It's almost a stream of consciousness run-on sentence. So, well, this could happen, then there'd be these people and she would meet him and he would... And it's an outpouring of all of the possibilities I've been thinking about for months. People often think that the writing process begins when you start putting the pen in hand or the keyboard. No, you think about these things for ages before. I'm coming towards the end of my work in progress, but of course I'm already thinking about the next one and the characters and what's going to happen. I have to keep pushing that to the back of my mind. But so my plan begins in this very chaotic form, and then I have to wrangle it. There'll be little fragments of conversations. There'll be characteristics, little foibles or quirks for this character or that character. And that's all done in a Word document. Yep. It's my initial planning document. And from that, I draw that into, I wrestle it into some sort of shape. My plan that I use is a point form plan. 1, 2, 3, 4, down to the very final thing that happens in the book. And alongside that are the character profiles and all of those sorts of things. So it's, yeah, my folder for whatever I'm working on has got lots and lots of documents in it.
Oh, I bet it has. Do you still get surprises though when you're writing?
Yeah. When I say I'm a planner, it's fairly recently I've come to understand that instead of every tiny thing worked out to begin with, the metaphor I see is almost like stepping stones going across a river. That, yes, there are major points where I'm planning, but in between there's all of this fluid stuff going backwards and forwards. And I leave them deliberately. They're room to flex my muscles to have stuff happen. And I am aware enough to think that, yeah, here is my plan. I've just written something. Something has happened here that I hadn't planned. And I'm quite willing to listen to characters, to listen to developments, to see things that have happened organically, and then to sort of alter my plan as we go along. So plan is not the be all and end all. It's the beginning.
It is, isn't it? Because I often have kids say to me, but doesn't it get boring? It doesn't, because you have characters that just appear and you have things that you go, wow. Yeah, I love planning. I'm a planner too, but that doesn't mean the surprises aren't there.
No, it's a safety net. It's useful. It keeps me going forward instead of going backwards or sideways. But yeah, I am alert for possibilities of things that grow naturally. And especially when characters are in conversation and they say things, and they're responding as they would. Of course she's going to say that if he says that. And then I know I'm onto something.
Exactly. So when you're working with young people, how do you inspire them to redraft? Because we both know redrafting is really important. How do you do that without terrifying them?
Yeah, it's daunting, and it's also, a lot of them can't see the point because they've never really done it properly. I just point out that it's what I do. This is what I do, and without it, my stories would not be as good as they could possibly be. And I will show them first draft, and then I'll put side by side a final draft and show them how it's improved through numbers of redrafts. Now, that's a demonstration. It's a modeling of how this works. But I do it because I'm committed. I'm absolutely committed to making this the best story as possible. Now, are those kids looking at that piece of writing they're doing for their teacher, are they wholeheartedly wishing it to be a piece of gold? Or are they feeling, yeah, good enough's okay? And if good enough's okay, their approach of not redrafting is actually quite a rational one. You redraft if you want to make things better, and it takes time. It's a commitment of time and effort. And if you've got lots of other stuff to do, maybe a draft and a bit of a polish, maybe that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Particularly with the time constraints on kids too. And those ones that write those, I call them runaway train stories, that go on and on and on and on and on. You can't say to them, honey, go back and rewrite that. It's just, yeah.
You do feel like it. But I just point out that professional writers, what we do, we redraft. We do a number of rewrites. If you want your story, your 40-page runaway train, if you want it to look good and be sophisticated, be prepared to do 3, 4, 5 drafts of that story. One of the things I do say for Runaway Trains is finish it. Just finish it. There is nothing like finishing a story and then going through the redrafting to teach people about the finality of the process. Even if it's a piece of rubbish and you look at it and you admit it's not very good, having gone through the process once, you've got a better handle on it for the next time.
Exactly. Do you enjoy, which do you prefer, writing or editing?
The writing, I enjoy the writing much more. It's freewheeling in lots of ways that editing can't be. But I do enjoy the editing where I've got a paragraph, I've got a sentence, I've got a chapter that's not bad. And through experience and through canniness that I've learned over many years, I make it better. That's a lovely feeling of looking at an okay sentence and making it into gold by some judicious editing.
Now, I know you do everything on the computer, but do you edit by hand?
No, edit on the computer straight away. And when I'm writing my first draft, I will use tricky things in Word to give me a hand. That I will leave little comments in the margin on Word's features that not many people use to remind myself when I come to the rewrite, oh yeah, it says here, don't forget to make sure he has a blue cap on here because in chapter 42, that's going to be really important. So all of those little reminders that I don't have time for when I'm in the rush of first draft. So I'll have hundreds of them ready for me when I start draft 2 that are just super important and useful for me. And all of the editing, I go through and use all the editing tricks. And when my editors, for a long time now, they will send me the edited manuscript in Word with all of the fancy word track changes, things that it takes a bit of getting used to.
It does, but it's actually fabulous because I can remember first book or second, must have been the second book, sitting on the phone for an hour and a half, going through page by page with the editor in Melbourne and me and Colac, and I'm just going, oh, it's so much easier now to edit and get those things done.
Very much so. The old days of pencil marks, and I wasn't quite sure what some of those tricky editor marks meant way back in the early days. And I'm trying to have a conversation with them by fitting my comments to their comments, and are they taking those comments in? Look, yeah, I'm much better doing it electronically.
So are you allowed to talk about, or not allowed, are you happy to talk about what you're working on at the moment, or do you prefer not to talk about new projects?
Yeah, I once interviewed Jonathan Stroud, who wrote the Bartimaeus trilogy many years ago. And I asked him the same question. I said, can you talk about work in progress? He's this lovely Englishman. And he looked at me and he said, well, I don't like to talk about my work in progress. They're like a hothouse flower. And by opening up the greenhouse, that the cold wind can come in and make it shrivel. So we talked about cricket after that. But me, no, I'm fine. There are times when I'm just beginning, when I'm in the first few chapters, I don't want to talk about it then because I'm not clear about what it's about. I can't talk about it in any meaningful way because I don't have a meaning yet. But I'm towards the end of this one. So yeah, I could talk this one up in lots of ways. But it's a bit of a reversion in some ways. This is a classic high fantasy story. We're talking magic, we're talking battles, we're talking intergenerational studies, family betrayals, we're talking about murders, we're talking about all sorts of stuff like that. It's got lashings of snarky banter as well, which is always fun. And it's
right up my alley. I love that stuff.
Oh, wonderful. I'm glad. So I'm a history fan. I love history and I've always loved history, even though I've realised lately that history is a fantasy writer's best friend, that you take periods from history, change the names a bit and add some magic and you've got a template ready to go. So this one, I've spread my elbows. It's huge. We've got essentially four different stories occurring across this fantasy world that I've invented and spent ages in that world building business. And so I'm tracking these characters right across this huge canvas. And the draft that I'm on, the first draft we've just crept over 200,000 words. So it is a biggie.
Oh, wow. Well, I've just finished Hilary Mantel's Mirror and the Light. 38 hours of listening. I committed to that, but oh God, it was good. It was good.
Excellent. But the difference between writing an historical novel and writing a fantasy novel is about that much, I reckon. You have to do the same sort of world building. People are not familiar with Elizabethan England. And so she has to do all of the detail, all of the scene setting that I have to do in a totally imaginary world, because people aren't familiar with this world that I'm inventing as well.
And she's got to put flesh to those bones. I shouldn't say flesh after Paul Cromwell's demise, but flesh to the characters' bones that we just know as names. It's fascinating. It really is.
Yeah. It is
fabulous.
An interesting process, and taking people elsewhere and introducing them to a foreign world, historical or imaginary, without boring them to death by ladling on detail, the dreaded info dump. That's the skill. That's something that I've been aware of for years, and I know how to do it. So that's where we're going with this book, and we'll just see how it turns out. I never start writing a story without knowing the ending.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Always have my ending in place before I begin. Now, whether I actually end up there or not, don't know. Usually I do, but sometimes I end up somewhere slightly adjacent because of what's happened in the writing. This one is still shaping up to hit this killer ending that I had worked out, ready to go. And it's a convergence with all of the different narrative threads coming together. Been a lot of fun. We'll see where we go.
Oh, I can't wait. I'm ready. I'll be at the door ready for it, ready to go.
Excellent. That's good.
Michael, it's been a delight to talk to you. Now, just for people who aren't aware and are looking for something to read, especially with winter upon us, Graveyard Shift in Ghost Town is out and about right now. And that's the sequel to, is it the Ghost Town, the other one's called?
Gap Year in Ghost Town. So first one is Gap Year in Ghost Town, came out a couple of years ago, and Graveyard Shift in Ghost Town came out last year. These are a lot of fun, and they're quite a departure for me. After years of writing in imaginary land, these are set in Melbourne. These are actually really, truly set in my favourite town of Melbourne, and changed everything in the writing. So instead of looking at this fantasy world and trying to imagine, now, how long will it take characters to get from this imaginary place to this other imaginary place? I've got characters going from Thornbury to St Kilda. Yeah, I know that. And if I don't, Google Maps can help.
Oh, Google Maps. It's your best friend, isn't it?
Very much. Google Maps, Google Street View, all of that. And so it's a lot of fun to incorporate real places and a bit of Melbourne history in there. And these characters, I can't help myself, even though there are dark and dangerous parts of the story, it's funny as well. It makes me laugh. And I hope that's the sort of thing that's appreciated out there.
I'm sure it is. I think, Michael, you can see in your eyes your passion for writing, and I know that comes out in your books. Thank you. I could talk to you all day, but, clearly you've got to finish that book because I'm ready to read it.
So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for that. It's just been a lovely conversation, a nice chat, and that's how I like these things.